December 30th, 1917. A remote village in the Chitwan district of Nepal. In a modest home carved into the hillside, a boy was born who would one day prove that courage has nothing to do with size and everything to do with the size of one's heart. His name was Lachhiman Gurung, son of Partiman Gurung. Standing at just 4 feet 11 inches tall, he would become a giant in the annals of military history. But this story doesn't begin with glory. It begins with rejection, poverty, and a determination that refused to accept no for an answer. This is the true story of how one impossibly small man held off 200 enemy soldiers with one hand, and in doing so embodied the motto of the Gurkhas: "Better to die than live as a coward." Before we discover what happened on that desperate night in May 1945, tell us where you're watching from. We love connecting with viewers worldwide who understand that true heroism isn't measured in inches, but in the iron will to stand when everything tells you to run. Nepal in the early 20th century was a land of breathtaking mountains and grinding poverty. Lachhiman grew up in Dahakani village, where life meant subsistence farming, where hunger was a constant companion, where boys grew up small and tough, or didn't grow up at all. The Gurung family had little. Like most villagers, they worked the land, tended livestock, and survived. Young Lachhiman was smaller than other boys his age, a consequence of childhood malnutrition that would follow him his entire life. But what he lacked in stature, he possessed in spirit. From an early age, Lachhiman knew the stories. Every Nepali boy did. The legendary tales of the Gurkhas, warriors from Nepal who had earned the respect and fear of the British Empire. The history was written in blood and honor. In 1814, the British East India Company made a fatal miscalculation. They believed the Nepalis would be easy prey, another conquest in their expansion across the Indian subcontinent. They were catastrophically wrong. The Gurkhas, fierce mountain warriors armed with their signature curved kukri knives, fought with such ferocity that British forces found themselves on the defensive. What malaria and desertion didn't claim from British ranks, the Gurkhas did. When the Anglo-Nepalese War ended in 1816, both sides had earned each other's respect. The British recognized what they had encountered: warriors of extraordinary courage and skill. They wanted these men fighting with them, not against them. Thus began one of the most unusual relationships in military history. The Gurkhas would serve the British Crown with legendary devotion, earning a reputation as some of the finest soldiers in the world. The British, in turn, would come to depend on them in every major conflict. Field Marshal Sam Manekshaw of the Indian Army would later observe, "If a man says he is not afraid of dying, he is either lying or he is a Gurkha." By the late 1930s, as war clouds gathered over Europe and Asia, young Lachhiman Gurung had one burning ambition: to join the Gurkha Rifles and uphold the warrior tradition of his people. He applied to the British Indian Army Recruitment Office. The officers measured him, 4 feet 11 inches. The peacetime minimum was 5 feet. Rejected. He tried again. Same result, too short. And again. Rejection. But Lachhiman refused to give up. His small frame housed an outsized determination. He would keep trying, keep applying, keep showing up until they gave him a chance. There's an apocryphal story told in his village. One day in 1940, Lachhiman's father sent him to the local shop to buy cigarettes. He never returned with those cigarettes. He went straight to the recruitment center instead. This time, finally, the answer was different. December 1940. The world was at war. Germany had conquered most of Europe. Japan was expanding aggressively across Asia. The British Empire needed soldiers desperately. Peacetime standards were luxuries they could no longer afford. 23-year-old Lachhiman Gurung stood before the recruitment officers once more. They looked at the diminutive young man, barely clearing 4.5 feet, thin from years of poor nutrition, but with eyes that burned with determination. In peacetime, he would have been sent away again. But this wasn't peacetime. The recruiters saw something in those eyes: fire, resolve. the indefinable quality that made Gurkhas legendary. "All right," they said, "you're in." Lachhiman Gurung was assigned to the 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles, one of the most storied regiments in the British Indian Army. Dating back to 1815, the Gurkha Rifles had fought in countless campaigns. Now they would face their toughest challenge, the Empire of Japan. Basic training revealed what the recruitment officers had sensed. What Lachhiman lacked in size, he compensated for with ferocity, skill, and an absolute refusal to quit. Where larger men struggled, he persevered. Where others complained, he endured silently. He became a rifleman, trained in the Lee Enfield bolt-action rifle, the standard weapon of British and Commonwealth forces. The Lee Enfield was a formidable weapon, 10-round magazine capacity. Reliable, accurate. But it was designed for right-handed operation. The bolt action was on the right side of the weapon. This detail would become critically important 4 years later. For now, Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung trained, learned, and prepared. He had achieved his dream. He was a Gurkha. Soon he would prove what that meant. While Europe captured the world's attention, another desperate struggle unfolded in the jungles of Burma. It would come to be called the Forgotten War, a brutal campaign fought in some of the world's harshest conditions. Burma, now Myanmar, was strategically crucial. It bordered British India to the west and China to the north. Control of Burma meant control of supply routes, of strategic positions, of the keys to the entire Asian theater. The Japanese had conquered Burma in early 1942, forcing British and Indian forces into a humiliating retreat. For 2 years, the Japanese held the country, using it as a springboard for attacks on India. But by 1944, the tide was turning. General Sir William Slim's 14th Army had stopped the Japanese thrust into India at the battles of Imphal and Kohima, inflicting devastating casualties. The Japanese army in Burma was now in retreat. But they weren't defeated. They remained dangerous, fanatical, willing to die rather than surrender. The Burma campaign was warfare at its most primitive and brutal. Dense jungle where visibility dropped to yards. Torrential monsoons that turned the ground into swamp. Diseases like malaria, dysentery, and cholera that killed as readily as bullets. And an enemy who fought with suicidal determination. Lachhiman Gurung's 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles, were veterans of this nightmare. They had fought through jungle and mountain, facing Japanese soldiers who would rather charge into machine gun fire than retreat. The Gurkhas had earned the respect even of their fanatical enemies. By spring 1945, the end was approaching. Allied forces were pushing deeper into Burma, systematically destroying Japanese positions. But the Japanese weren't running. They were withdrawing in order, making the Allies pay for every mile. This is where our story reaches its climax. In a small village called Taung Dao in the Irrawaddy Valley, where Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung would face a test that would have broken any ordinary man. Late April 1945, the 89th Indian Infantry Brigade, including the 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles, received their orders. Cross the mighty Irrawaddy River. Block the Japanese withdrawal route north of the Prom Taungup Road, intercept and destroy the retreating enemy forces. The Irrawaddy was one of Burma's great rivers, wide and dangerous. Crossing it under potential enemy fire required careful coordination. But the Gurkhas were experienced jungle fighters. They made the crossing successfully and pushed north. By May 9th, they had the Japanese on the run. Intelligence reported enemy forces withdrawing toward the Taung Dao Valley. The plan was simple. 2 companies of the 4th 8th Gurkha Rifles, B Company and C Company, would move to the village of Taung Dao and block the Japanese escape route. It should have been a textbook blocking operation. The Japanese would run into the Gurkha positions and be destroyed or captured, but war rarely follows the textbook. When the Japanese arrived at Taung Dao, they didn't retreat. Instead, hundreds of Japanese soldiers, desperate and dangerous, counterattacked in force. The 2 Gurkha companies suddenly found themselves surrounded and cut off from the main British force. This was a critical moment. A Japanese breakthrough here would compromise the entire Allied position. If the Gurkhas were overrun, the Japanese could punch through the British lines, potentially endangering the entire operation. The Gurkha commanders quickly assessed the situation. They were outnumbered, surrounded, but they had good defensive positions. They would hold. That was what Gurkhas did. Among the defenders was 27-year-old Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung. He had been assigned to the most forward post of his platoon, a small trench position almost 100 yards ahead of the main company defensive line. It was the tip of the spear, the first position the Japanese would hit if they attacked. With Lachhiman were two other Gurkhas, 3 men in a trench, armed with Lee-Enfield rifles and grenades, representing the platoon's early warning system and first line of defense. As darkness fell on May 12, 1945, the 3 soldiers settled into their trench, weapons ready, eyes scanning the jungle. Behind them, the rest of the platoon prepared defensive positions. They all knew an attack was coming. They just didn't know when or how strong it would be. The night was thick with tension. In the jungle, sounds played tricks. Every rustle could be wind or enemy. The darkness was absolute, broken only by occasional starlight filtering through the canopy. Then, at 1:20 a.m. on May 13th, the night exploded. The Japanese attacked with overwhelming force. At least 200 soldiers, possibly more, screaming battle cries, charging through the darkness toward the Gurkha positions. The forward trench, Lachhiman's position, bore the brunt of the assault. This was by design. The Japanese knew military tactics: overwhelm the forward positions first, then roll up the defensive line like a carpet. In the trench, the 3 Gurkhas opened fire. The Lee-Enfield rifles cracked repeatedly, muzzle flashes lighting up attackers charging through the darkness. Japanese soldiers fell, but more kept coming, a human wave willing to die to break through. Then Lachhiman saw something arc through the darkness. A Japanese grenade landing on the edge of the trench. Reactions in combat are instinctive, trained until they become automatic. Lachhiman didn't think. He acted. He lunged forward, grabbed the grenade, and hurled it back toward the enemy. The grenade exploded in midair with a satisfying boom. Japanese soldiers in the blast radius went down, but there was no time to celebrate. Another grenade landed in the trench, this one inches from his feet. Again, Lachhiman grabbed it and threw it back. Another explosion, more screams from the darkness. The Japanese were using grenades to clear the trench before rushing it. Standard assault tactics. Soften the position with explosives, then overrun it with infantry. A third grenade landed just outside the trench. Lachhiman saw it, knew he had seconds. He lunged forward, grabbing it as he'd done twice before, preparing to throw it back at the enemy. He never got the chance. The grenade exploded in his right hand. The blast was catastrophic. Lachhiman's fingers were blown off, his right hand pulverized into bloody ruin. His arm shattered from the explosion. Burning shrapnel tore into his face, his torso, his right leg. Blood poured from multiple wounds. The concussion wave threw the other 2 Gurkhas off their feet. They crumpled to the bottom of the trench, badly wounded, semi-conscious. Lachhiman fell backward, half-blinded by the flash, his mouth filling with blood, his right arm a mangled mess. The pain must have been unimaginable. Any normal man would have gone into shock, would have laid down and waited to die or be captured. Lachhiman Gurung was not a normal man. He was a Gurkha. Through the blood and pain and shock, Lachhiman heard them coming. Japanese soldiers, emboldened by the grenade explosion, charging the trench for the final assault. They had seen the explosion. They knew the defenders were down. This position was theirs. Lachhiman managed to scream the ancient battle cry of the Gurkhas, "Jai Mahakali! Ayo Gorkali!" Glory to the goddess Kali. The Gurkhas are upon you. He struggled to his knees, his vision swimming, his right arm useless and gushing blood. His 2 comrades were unconscious or too badly hurt to fight. He was alone. The Japanese were coming in waves, screaming their own battle cries, confident in their numbers and momentum. 200 soldiers against 1 badly wounded man. The outcome seemed inevitable. Lachhiman reached for his Lee-Enfield rifle with his left hand. The weapon was designed for right-handed use. The bolt action that needed to be worked after every shot was on the right side. Under normal circumstances, it would be nearly impossible to operate effectively with only the left hand. These were not normal circumstances, and Lachhiman Gurung was not a normal soldier. He braced the rifle against his body, worked the bolt with his left hand, acquired a target in the darkness, and fired. A Japanese soldier went down. Bolt back with the left hand, ejecting the spent cartridge. Bolt forward, chambering a new round. Aim. Fire. Another enemy soldier fell. The Japanese kept coming, wave after wave. They couldn't believe one wounded man was still fighting. They charged again and again, trying to overwhelm him through sheer numbers. Lachhiman kept firing. Between shots, he screamed defiance at them. "Come and fight a Gurkha!" His voice carried across the battlefield, audible even over the gunfire. The rest of the platoon, dug in behind him, could hear their comrades' challenge. They were cut off, surrounded, outnumbered, but hearing Lachhiman's defiant shouts steeled their resolve. The Japanese concentrated on Lachhiman's position. They had to take this trench to break through. They threw more grenades, but Lachhiman had learned that lesson. He pressed himself against the trench wall, letting the explosions pass over him. When the Japanese rushed in after the grenade blasts, expecting to find a dead man, they instead found a blood-soaked Gurkha rifleman who shot them at point-blank range. The Lee-Enfield held 10 rounds in its magazine. Lachhiman would fire until empty, then somehow reload with his left hand, fumbling with ammunition pouches, struggling to insert cartridges into the magazine, all while maintaining awareness of the next attack wave. This wasn't precision shooting. This was survival combat at its most desperate. But Lachhiman had been trained well, and training combined with pure will can accomplish the impossible. The Japanese couldn't understand it. They had overwhelming numerical superiority. They had already wounded or killed the defenders. By all logic, by all tactical calculation, this position should have fallen in the first 5 minutes. Yet it held. One small man with one working hand, operating a rifle designed for 2 hands, holding off an entire assault force through sheer bloody-minded refusal to surrender. The battle raged for 4 hours. 4 hours of continuous combat. 4 hours of Lachhiman Gurung fighting alone against impossible odds. During those 4 hours, the Japanese launched wave after wave of attacks. They tried frontal assaults. They tried flanking movements. They threw grenades until their supply ran low. They shot at his muzzle flashes, hitting the trench repeatedly, but somehow never landing the killing shot on the small man inside. Lachhiman's left hand became a blur of motion. Load, bolt back, bolt forward, aim, fire, repeat, again, and again, and again. His hand cramped. His muscles screamed. Blood loss made him dizzy, but he kept fighting. His right arm hung useless, still bleeding despite his body's attempt to clot the wounds. Shrapnel wounds in his face and leg burned. His right eye, damaged by the grenade blast, was swelling shut. He was fighting half-blind, one-handed and alone. But he was a Gurkha, and Gurkhas don't surrender. The Japanese began to fear him. Here was a warrior who should be dead 100 times over, yet he kept fighting. In Japanese military culture, such determination was honorable, but it was also terrifying. What kind of soldier refuses to die even when mortally wounded? The Gurkha kind. Behind Lachhiman's position, the rest of the platoon and company fought their own desperate battle. But knowing that their forward position still held, that Rifleman Gurung was still fighting, inspired them. If that small man in the forward trench could hold off an army, they could hold their positions too. The Japanese commanders must have been furious. Their entire attack was bogging down because one wounded soldier refused to be killed. They had to take that trench, but every attempt cost them men. Bodies piled up in front of Lachhiman's position, but still the diminutive rifleman fought on. As dawn approached, the intensity of the Japanese attacks finally began to diminish. They had suffered catastrophic casualties, Their assault had failed. The Gurkha defensive line had held. In the growing light, Lachhiman could finally see what he had done. When the firing finally stopped, observers counted the enemy dead in the immediate vicinity of the Gurkha positions. 87 Japanese soldiers had been killed in and around the company's defensive area. Of those 87 dead, 31 lay directly in front of Lachhiman Gurung's trench. 31 enemy soldiers killed by one man with one hand in 4 hours of continuous combat. The evidence was undeniable. Shell casings littered the trench. The rifle barrel was hot enough to burn skin. And in a rough semicircle in front of the position, the bodies told the story of a defense that should have been impossible. Lachhiman was barely conscious when help finally reached him. Blood loss and shock were taking their toll. His right hand was destroyed beyond any hope of saving. His right arm was shattered. Shrapnel wounds covered his face and body. His right eye was badly damaged, but he was alive. Against all odds, all logic, all probability, Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung had survived. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel W.C. Walker, later wrote in his Victoria Cross recommendation, "Had the enemy succeeded in overrunning and occupying Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung's trench, the whole of the reverse slope position would have been completely dominated and turned. This rifleman, by his magnificent example, so inspired his comrades to resist the enemy to the last, that although surrounded and cut off for 3 days and 2 nights, they held and smashed every attack. The battle wasn't over yet. The Japanese continued attacking for another 48 hours, trying to break through the Gurkha positions, but their will was broken. They had thrown everything at the defenders and failed. The sight of one wounded man holding off 200 had shaken them. On May 15th, 2 days after Lachhiman's incredible stand, Allied reinforcements finally broke through to the besieged Gurkha companies. The defenders had held. The Japanese withdrawal had been blocked. The mission was a success, but the price had been high. Lachhiman was evacuated immediately to a field hospital, then to a base hospital. Doctors examined his wounds and shook their heads. The right hand was gone, destroyed so completely there was nothing to save. The arm was shattered but might be saved, though it would never function properly. The right eye was damaged beyond repair. He would be blind on that side for the rest of his life. For most soldiers, such injuries would mean the end of military service. But Lachhiman Gurung was not most soldiers. December 19th, 1945. The Red Fort in Delhi, one of India's most historic landmarks, site of Mughal emperors, and now the location for one of the most important military ceremonies of the war. Field Marshal Archibald Wavell, Viceroy and Governor-General of India, stood before ranks of assembled soldiers. Among them, standing at attention despite his injuries, was Havildar Lachhiman Gurung. He had been promoted from rifleman in recognition of his actions. The award ceremony was attended by military dignitaries, government officials, and a special group of attendees, villagers from Lachhiman's home in Nepal, who had carried his elderly father on a palanquin for 11 days to witness this moment. Wavell read the citation, his voice carrying across the assembly. At Taungdao in Burma, on the night of 12-13 May 1945, Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung was manning the most forward post of his platoon, which bore the brunt of an attack by at least 200 of the Japanese enemy. He hurled back 2 hand grenades which had fallen on his trench, but the third exploded in his right hand, blowing off his fingers, shattering his arm, and severely wounding him in the face, body, and right leg. The assembled troops stood in awed silence. Many of them were combat veterans, but what they were hearing defied belief. Wavell continued. His 2 comrades were also badly wounded, but the rifleman, now alone and disregarding his wounds, loaded and fired his rifle with his left hand for 4 hours, calmly waiting for each new onslaught and determined not to yield an inch of ground. Partyman Gurung, Lachhiman's father, watched with tears streaming down his weathered face. His son, the small boy who had been rejected repeatedly for being too short, was receiving the highest military honor in the British Empire. For 4 hours, Rifleman Gurung remained alone at his post. His comrades could hear him shouting, "Come and fight a Gurkha!" The following morning, of the 87 enemy dead found in the company's immediate locality, 31 lay in front of Rifleman Gurung's section. Wavell then presented the Victoria Cross, a bronze medal cast from Russian cannons captured during the Crimean War, inscribed with the simple words, "For Valor." It was pinned to Lachhiman's uniform. He stood at attention, his empty right sleeve pinned to his tunic, his right eye clouded and sightless, but his bearing proud and military. He was one of only 13 Gurkhas to receive the Victoria Cross during World War II. Each VC recipient had performed acts of extraordinary courage, but even among these heroes, Lachhiman's story stood out. Later, when asked about that night, Lachhiman gave a response that embodied the Gurkha spirit. "I had to fight because there was no other way. I felt I was going to die anyway, so I might as well die standing on my feet. All I knew was that I had to go on and hold them back. I am glad that helped the other soldiers in my platoon, but they would have all done the same thing." The humility was genuine. In Lachhiman's mind, he had simply done his duty. Any Gurkha would have done the same. He didn't see himself as a hero. He was just a soldier who refused to quit. But the world saw him differently. News of the one-handed Gurkha who held off 200 Japanese soldiers spread throughout the Allied forces. He became a legend, living proof of the Gurkha fighting spirit. For most soldiers, losing a hand and an eye would mark the end of military service. Lachhiman Gurung continued serving with the 8th Gurkha Rifles. He remained in uniform, training new recruits, passing on his experience, embodying the warrior spirit that defined the Gurkhas. When India gained independence in 1947, the Gurkha regiments were divided between the British and Indian armies. Lachhiman chose to transfer to the newly independent Indian Army, serving his final months before retirement with the rank of Havildar, equivalent to sergeant. In 1947, at age 30, Lachhiman finally returned to his village in Nepal. The young man who had left 7 years earlier returned a decorated war hero, but also a man carrying visible and invisible scars from his service. He married and had 3 children from his first marriage. After his first wife passed away, he remarried and had 2 more sons. One of his sons would later become an officer in the 8th Gurkha Rifles, continuing the family tradition. Lachhiman returned to farming, working a small plot of land, raising buffalo, oxen, goats, and cows. He lived simply, as he had always lived, finding satisfaction in daily work and family life. But his village knew what he was. Children grew up hearing the story of the small man who had fought like a giant. Veterans would visit, paying respects to a living legend, and Lachhiman would tell them the same thing. He had only done his duty. The years passed. Lachhiman aged, but remained active in his community. In 1995, recognizing that his modest home was inadequate for an aging Victoria Cross recipient, the Gurkha Welfare Trust arranged for a new house to be built near the Gurkha Welfare Center at Chitwan. That same year, Lachhiman was invited to London. Prime Minister John Major personally presented him with a check for $100,500 on behalf of the Gurkha Welfare Fund, recognizing the service and sacrifice of Gurkha veterans. The publicity from this visit brought Lachhiman's story to a new generation. British citizens learned about the Gurkhas who had served the crown with such devotion and began asking difficult questions about how these veterans were treated. For decades, Gurkha veterans faced an injustice. They had served Britain with legendary courage and loyalty, but were not allowed to settle in the UK after retirement. Unlike other Commonwealth soldiers, Gurkhas who had retired before 1997 were denied the right to live in Britain. This policy was indefensible. Men who had risked their lives for Britain were told they couldn't live there. Veterans who had earned Victoria Crosses were denied what soldiers from other countries received automatically. In 2008, at age 90, Lachhiman Gurung joined 4 other Gurkha veterans in a legal challenge against the British government. The case was led by actress Joanna Lumley, whose father had served with the Gurkhas in Burma. She understood what these men had sacrificed. The sight of the diminutive elderly Lachhiman Gurung, wearing his row of medals with the Victoria Cross in pride of place, became a powerful symbol. Here was a man who had given everything for Britain, who had literally lost his hand and eye in British service, being told he couldn't retire in the country he had bled for. The British public was outraged. How could the government deny entry to such heroes? The media coverage was intense. Lachhiman's story was told and retold. The one-handed Gurkha who had held off 200 Japanese soldiers couldn't get permission to live in Britain. The High Court ordered the government to review its policy. Under public pressure, the rules were changed. Gurkha veterans who had served before 1997 would be allowed to settle in the UK. Lachhiman moved to Hounslow in West London, where his granddaughter Amrita could care for him. He had won his final battle, not with a rifle, but with quiet dignity and the power of his story. London treated him as the hero he was. He attended remembrance ceremonies at the cenotaph. He was guest of honor at the Victoria Cross and George Cross Association reunions. In 2006, he attended a service of thanksgiving for gallantry and valor at Westminster Abbey, where he met the Queen. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. The medals told the story even if they didn't know the details. But for those who did know, meeting Lachhiman Gurung was meeting living history. He spoke at schools, at military functions, at charity events. He never boasted, never exaggerated. He simply told the truth, that on one terrible night in Burma, he had refused to surrender because that wasn't what Gurkhas did. Young British soldiers would meet him and struggle to comprehend the magnitude of his actions. 4 hours, one hand, 200 enemies, 31 killed. How was it even possible? Lachhiman's response was always the same. I had no choice. I was a soldier. I did my duty. November 19, 2010. Lachhiman Gurung was admitted to Charing Cross Hospital in London. At 92 years old, his body was finally giving out. He had survived grenade explosions, bullets, tropical diseases, and 9 decades of hard living. Now, pneumonia was taking its toll. His family gathered around him. His wife Manmaya, his 5 children. Grandchildren who had grown up hearing stories of their legendary grandfather. They knew the end was near. On December 12, 2010, one day before the 65th anniversary of his Victoria Cross ceremony, Lachhiman Gurung passed away, surrounded by his family. The news spread quickly through the Gurkha community and beyond. Britain had lost a genuine hero. Nepal had lost one of its greatest sons. The military world had lost a living embodiment of courage and duty. His funeral was held on December 22, 2010, at Hounslow Civic Center. Military honor guards flanked the coffin. Gurkha veterans, some elderly themselves, stood at attention. British military officials paid their respects. The local Nepalese community turned out in force. There were representatives from the Ministry of Defense, from the Gurkha Welfare Trust, from veterans organizations. But there were also ordinary people who had heard his story and wanted to pay respects to a man who embodied heroism. The eulogy captured what Lachhiman represented. His actions on that night in May 1945 were exceptional even by the highest standards of military valor. But what made Havildar Gurung truly special was not just what he did in one night, but how he lived every day after, with humility, dignity, and an unwavering commitment to duty. The honor guard fired a rifle salute. The last post was played, and Lachhiman Gurung was laid to rest, far from the Nepali mountains of his birth, in the country he had fought for 7 decades earlier. Today, Lachhiman Gurung's Victoria Cross is held by his parent unit, the 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles in India. It serves as an inspiration to new generations of soldiers, a physical reminder of what one man can accomplish through courage and determination. Outside the Ministry of Defense building in London stands a monument to the Gurkha soldier. Thousands pass it daily. Some know the stories it represents. Others see it and wonder. But for those who know the history, that statue represents men like Lachhiman Gurung. In Nepal, his story is told to children as an example of courage and duty. The small boy who was rejected for being too short became a giant in the nation's history. His village celebrates him as a local hero who represented Nepal on the world stage. In British military academies, his actions are studied as a case study in defensive warfare and the importance of morale. The tactical lesson is clear. One determined soldier in a key position can have disproportionate impact on a battle's outcome. But the deeper lesson goes beyond tactics. Lachhiman Gurung proved that heroism isn't about size, strength, or perfect conditions. It's about refusing to quit when quitting is the logical choice. It's about duty, overcoming fear. It's about standing when you have every reason to fall. The Gurkhas continue to serve in the British Army today, maintaining their reputation as elite soldiers. When they take their oath, many remember Havildar Lachhiman Gurung VC and the standard he set. In 2015, on the 70th anniversary of his action at Taungdao, veterans gathered to remember that night. They read his citation, they honored his memory, and they reminded the world that true heroes don't seek glory, they simply refuse to fail their comrades. The Burma campaign has been called the Forgotten War. It lacked the dramatic profile of the European theater. The conditions were brutal, the casualties high, the strategic impact debatable. But for the men who fought there, it was real, desperate, and crucial. Lachhiman Gurung's story ensures that this campaign won't be completely forgotten. His actions embody the Burma campaign's character: small unit actions, desperate defenses, individual heroism making the difference between victory and defeat. Today, when military historians discuss the greatest acts of valor in World War II, Lachhiman Gurung's name invariably appears. 1 man, 1 hand, 200 enemies, 4 hours, 31 killed. Victory snatched from certain defeat through sheer will. The numbers tell a story, but they don't capture the full truth. They don't convey the pain of fighting with a shattered arm. They don't describe the exhaustion of 4 hours of continuous combat. They don't explain the fear that must be overcome to stand when every instinct screams to run. What they do show is what human beings are capable of when pushed to the absolute limit. When death seems certain, when pain is overwhelming, when every tactical consideration says surrender or retreat, the human spirit can still choose to fight. To understand Lachhiman Gurung, you must understand the Gurkhas. This isn't just another military unit. The Gurkha tradition represents something deeper, a warrior culture that has survived for centuries in the mountains of Nepal. The motto of the Gurkhas is simple and profound: Kayar hunnu banda marnu ramro, better to die than live as a coward. This isn't empty bravado. It's a philosophy that permeates every aspect of Gurkha culture. From childhood, boys in the mountain villages learn that courage is the highest virtue, that honor matters more than life, that protecting your comrades is sacred duty. The kukri, the distinctive curved knife carried by every Gurkha, symbolizes this tradition. Legend says that once a kukri is drawn, it must taste blood before it can be sheathed. Whether literally true or not, the legend captures the Gurkha commitment. Once engaged, there is no retreat. Field Marshal Sam Manekshaw, himself no stranger to combat, observed, "If you tell a Gurkha to hold a position, he will hold it until he is dead. You need not give him further instructions." This wasn't hyperbole. Throughout their service with the British Empire, Gurkhas established a reputation for absolute reliability. In 1897, at the Battle of Saragari, 21 Sikh soldiers held a post against 10,000 Pashtun warriors, fighting to the last man. The Gurkhas had similar stories from multiple campaigns. What makes this spirit even more remarkable is that it persisted despite often being treated as second-class soldiers by the British Empire. Gurkhas were paid less than British soldiers. They faced discrimination. They were often given the most dangerous assignments. Yet their loyalty never wavered. This wasn't stupidity or blind obedience. It was a cultural commitment to honor and duty that transcended politics and economics. Once you accepted a Gurkha's oath, he would die before breaking it. Lachhiman Gurung embodied this spirit perfectly. Standing 4 feet 11 inches tall, weighing perhaps 120 pounds soaking wet, he possessed nothing in the way of physical intimidation. What he possessed was the Gurkha spirit, and that proved more powerful than any advantage of size or strength. Over the years, others who were present at Taung Dao shared their memories of that night. Their accounts provide additional detail and context to Lachhiman's official citation. Havildar Lachhiman Gurung, who was in the main defensive position behind Lachhiman's forward trench, recalled in a 1985 interview, "We could hear him shouting throughout the night. Even when we thought he must be dead, his voice would rise again. Ayo Gurkhali." We knew if Lachhiman was still fighting, we had to keep fighting too. His courage gave us courage. The Japanese must have thought they were facing a company of soldiers, not one wounded man. Lieutenant Geoffrey Booth, the British officer commanding Lachhiman's platoon, wrote in his diary, "I have never witnessed such raw courage. Rifleman Gurung had every reason to abandon his post. He was grievously wounded. His position was being overrun. No one would have blamed him for withdrawing. Instead, he fought like 10 men. In my years of combat, I have seen many brave deeds, but nothing comparable to what that small man accomplished that night." The Japanese perspective was harder to document. Most of the soldiers who attacked Lachhiman's position died in the attempt. But captured Japanese soldiers from other parts of the Taung Dao battle later spoke of the assault. One Japanese corporal, captured 2 days after the battle, mentioned the Demon Trench in his interrogation. When pressed for details, he explained that his company had been told to avoid the forward position on the left flank because it was defended by a demon that cannot be killed. Whether he was referring specifically to Lachhiman's trench or speaking more generally, the description is telling. The Japanese military culture valued courage above all else. To earn their fear was a remarkable achievement. The fact that they continued attacking that single position for 4 hours, losing dozens of men in the process, suggests they either didn't believe it was defended by just one man or couldn't accept that one man could stop them. From a medical perspective, what Lachhiman survived was extraordinary. The grenade that exploded in his hand produced multiple catastrophic injuries that should have been fatal. The blast destroyed his right hand completely. The bones were shattered, the flesh pulverized. Modern trauma surgery might have saved portions of the hand, but in a jungle field hospital in 1945, amputation was the only option. The shrapnel wounds to his face, including the damage to his right eye, risked infection in the tropical environment. Without antibiotics, which were still relatively new in 1945 and scarce in the Burma theater, infection could easily prove fatal. The blood loss alone should have incapacitated him. Losing a hand produces massive hemorrhaging. Add the shrapnel wounds and he was losing blood from multiple sites simultaneously. In normal circumstances, a wounded soldier would go into shock within minutes. But Lachhiman fought for 4 hours. His body should have shut down. His blood pressure should have dropped until he lost consciousness. Yet somehow, through sheer willpower or extraordinary physiology, he remained conscious and effective. The trauma doctors who treated him couldn't explain it. By all medical understanding, he should have been dead or at minimum unconscious. Instead, when stretcher bearers finally reached him after dawn, he was still alert, still maintaining watch, still clutching his rifle. One doctor's notation in his medical file simply read, "Exceptional constitution, will to survive beyond normal parameters." What they were documenting was something that science struggles to explain: the power of the human will to override biological limitations when pushed to extremes. While Lachhiman Gurung became the most famous defender at Taungdao, it's important to remember the larger battle. He wasn't fighting alone in a vacuum. Behind him, an entire Gurkha company was engaged in desperate combat. B Company and C Company of the 4th 8th Gurkha Rifles were surrounded for 3 days and 2 nights. They fought off repeated Japanese attacks from all directions. Supplies were limited. Water ran low. Medical support was minimal. Yet they held. Every position, every trench, every foxhole became its own desperate stand. When the relief force finally broke through on May 15th, they found the Gurkha positions still intact, still fighting, still defiant. The casualty figures tell the story. The 2 Gurkha companies suffered 32 killed and 98 wounded out of approximately 300 men engaged. That's a 43% casualty rate, which in military terms indicates the intensity of combat. The Japanese forces suffered far worse. Estimates suggested over 300 Japanese killed around the Taungdao positions. Many more were wounded and evacuated. The assault that was supposed to break through the Allied lines instead shattered itself against Gurkha determination. Lachhiman's stand at the forward trench was the most dramatic individual action, but it was part of a larger tapestry of courage. Every Gurkha soldier in those positions earned their reputation that night. The battle demonstrated a fundamental truth about military operations. Determined defenders with good positions can inflict disproportionate casualties on attackers, even when heavily outnumbered. But that equation only works if the defenders refuse to break. The Gurkhas refused to break. And at the tip of the spear, Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung showed them how. Lachhiman paid a heavy price for his heroism. The physical injuries were obvious. The loss of his right hand, the permanent damage to his right eye, the shrapnel scars that covered his face and body. But the invisible wounds ran deeper. Like all combat veterans, especially those who experienced the intensity of close-quarters night fighting, Lachhiman carried psychological scars. He rarely spoke about the nightmares. Gurkha culture didn't encourage discussing such things. But family members noted that he would sometimes wake at night, his left hand reaching for a rifle that wasn't there, reliving that night in Burma. The pain in his right arm never fully went away. Nerve damage from the explosion caused chronic discomfort. Cold weather made it worse. He learned to live with it, as he learned to live with having only one hand and partial vision. Simple tasks that others took for granted required adaptation. Writing, eating, working. Everything had to be relearned with the left hand. For a proud man who valued self-sufficiency, this was a difficult adjustment. Yet he never complained publicly, never expressed regret for his actions, never suggested that the cost wasn't worth paying. When asked about his injuries, he would simply say, "This is the price of duty. I paid it willingly." This stoicism was both admirable and concerning. Modern understanding of PTSD and combat trauma suggests that Lachhiman almost certainly suffered from what today would be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress. But in the 1940s and 50s, such conditions weren't well understood and treatment wasn't available. Veterans like Lachhiman were expected to simply readjust to civilian life, to put the war behind them and move on. Many struggled to do so. The transition from the intensity of combat to the mundane routine of peacetime could be jarring. For Lachhiman, returning to farming in rural Nepal provided some therapy. Physical work, close to the land in the mountains he'd grown up in. It wasn't professional treatment, but it was healing in its own way. His family provided support, though they couldn't fully understand what he'd experienced. How could they? None of them had faced what he'd faced, had done what he'd done. In some ways, heroes are isolated by their own exceptional experiences. Beyond the Victoria Cross, Lachhiman received other recognition over the years. In 2008, he was made an honorary citizen of Hounslow, the London borough where he spent his final years. The British Gurkha Welfare Society made him a patron. using his story to raise awareness and funds for Gurkha veterans. His presence at fundraising events, medals gleaming on his chest, empty sleeve pinned neatly, drew attention to the cause. Schools in Britain and Nepal studied his story as part of their history curriculum. Children learned about courage, duty, and sacrifice through the tale of the small man who held off an army. In 2010, shortly before his death, the Royal Mail issued a set of stamps honoring Victoria Cross recipients. Lachhiman Gurung was featured, his image and story preserved on a small piece of postal history. Military museums in Britain, India, and Nepal maintain exhibits about him. The Imperial War Museum in London includes his story in their World War II galleries. The Gurkha Museum in Winchester features a prominent display about his actions. Perhaps most meaningfully, the 8th Gurkha Rifles and its successor units keep his memory alive. New recruits hear his story during their training. They learn about the standard he set, the example he provided. When young Gurkha soldiers face difficult moments in training or operations, instructors remind them, Havildar Gurung fought for 4 hours with one hand. You can do this. It's not meant to diminish their struggles, but to provide perspective. If Lachhiman could do the impossible under the worst conditions, then others can find strength to overcome their own challenges. Lachhiman's story happened within the larger context of the Burma campaign, one of World War II's most brutal theaters of operation. The Burma campaign killed approximately 71,000 Allied soldiers and wounded another 87,000. Disease claimed as many casualties as combat. The jungle environment was merciless, with monsoons that turned battlefields into swamps, heat that caused heat stroke and dehydration, and diseases like malaria, dysentery, and typhus that ravaged both armies. Japanese forces suffered even worse. Estimates suggest over 150,000 Japanese soldiers died in Burma, many from starvation and disease as their supply lines collapsed. The Japanese policy of fighting to the death rather than surrendering meant casualty rates far exceeded normal military expectations. The Gurkha regiments bore a disproportionate share of the fighting. The 4th, the 8th Gurkha Rifles alone suffered over 1,000 casualties during the Burma campaign. These losses came from a relatively small unit, indicating the intensity of their operations. British, Indian, African, and other Allied units fought alongside the Gurkhas, all enduring the same harsh conditions. The 14th Army, which Lachhiman's unit was part of, earned the nickname the Forgotten Army because their struggles received less attention than the European theater. Yet they were fighting battles just as crucial. If Burma had remained in Japanese hands, the supply route to China would have been cut. India would have remained threatened, and the eventual Allied victory would have been delayed or complicated. In this context, battles like Taungdao mattered. They weren't headline-grabbing operations, but they were essential pieces of the larger strategic puzzle. Blocking the Japanese withdrawal, inflicting casualties, maintaining pressure, these unglamorous tasks ground down Japanese military power. Lachhiman's stand, viewed from this perspective, was one small action in a vast campaign. Yet it exemplified what was happening throughout Burma. Determined Allied soldiers refusing to yield, fighting under terrible conditions, making the Japanese pay for every mile. What makes Lachhiman's story transcendent is what it says about human resistance to overwhelming force. Military history is filled with last stands, desperate defenses, and heroic defeats. The Spartans at Thermopylae, the Texans at the Alamo, the British at Rorke's Drift. These stories resonate because they speak to something fundamental in human nature, the refusal to accept defeat even when defeat is certain. But Lachhiman's stand was different. The Spartans knew they were buying time for Greece to prepare. The Texans were making a political statement. The British at Rorke's Drift were defending a key supply depot. They had strategic reasons for their resistance. Lachhiman had only one reason: duty. He held his position because he was ordered to hold it. He fought because he was a soldier, and soldiers fight. There was no grand strategic calculation, no political purpose, no guarantee that his sacrifice would matter. He simply refused to quit, and that refusal changed everything. This is what makes his story so powerful. It wasn't about tactics or strategy, it was about character, about the quality of spirit that enables a human being to continue functioning when every rational calculation says to stop. Philosophers have debated for centuries what constitutes true courage. Is it the absence of fear, the ability to act despite fear, the willingness to sacrifice for others, the commitment to duty over self-preservation? Lachhiman Gurung embodied all of these definitions. He was afraid. Only a fool wouldn't be afraid when surrounded by 200 enemy soldiers. He acted despite that fear. He was willing to die to protect his comrades. And he placed duty above his own survival. This is courage in its purest form, stripped of glory and romance, reduced to its essential elements. A human being choosing to stand when standing seems impossible. What can Lachhiman Gurung's story teach us today, decades after that night in Burma? First, that physical limitations don't determine capability. Lachhiman was rejected repeatedly for being too small. By conventional metrics, he shouldn't have been a soldier, yet he became one of the most effective soldiers of his generation. The lesson: don't let others define your limitations. Second, that preparation matters. Lachhiman survived because he was well-trained. He knew his weapon intimately. He had practiced until operating it became automatic. When the crisis came, he didn't have to think. His training took over. The lesson: invest in developing skills before you need them. Third, that willpower can overcome tremendous obstacles. Medical science says he should have collapsed from blood loss and shock. He didn't. Military science says one man can't hold off 200 attackers. He did. The lesson: human will can achieve extraordinary things when properly focused. Fourth, that duty and honor still matter. In an age that often mocks traditional values, Lachhiman's story reminds us that commitment to something larger than yourself gives life meaning. He didn't fight for glory or recognition. He fought because it was his duty. The lesson: purpose provides strength. Finally, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Lachhiman wasn't superhuman. He was a poor farmer from rural Nepal who became a soldier. He had no special advantages, no exceptional physical gifts. What he had was character. The lesson: heroism is available to anyone willing to pay its price. These lessons aren't just military. They apply to any situation where someone faces overwhelming challenges. The single parent working multiple jobs to provide for their children. The student overcoming poverty to pursue education. The entrepreneur building a business against long odds. The patient fighting terminal illness. They all face their own version of Lachhiman's night at Taung Dao. The specifics differ, but the fundamental challenge is the same. To keep fighting when quitting would be easier. To stand when falling would be understandable. To refuse to surrender to circumstance. In 2009, at a ceremony in London honoring Gurkha veterans, Lachhiman Gurung was asked to say a few words to the assembled crowd. He was 91 years old, frail, his voice soft but clear. He spoke in Nepali, translated for the audience: "I am not special. Every Gurkha would have done the same. We are taught from childhood that honor matters more than life, that protecting your brothers is sacred duty, that surrendering is not an option. I simply did what any Gurkha would do." He paused, his remaining left hand touching the Victoria Cross on his chest. "But I hope that people remember not just what I did, but why. I fought for my comrades, for the men behind me who depended on me to hold my position. If I had failed, they would have died. That's why I couldn't quit. Not because I was brave, but because I couldn't live with myself if I let them down." Another pause. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every translated word. Young people ask me about courage. I tell them it's not about being unafraid. I was terrified that night. Every moment I expected to die. But courage is doing your duty despite the fear. It's standing when everything tells you to run. It's protecting others even when you can't protect yourself. He finished with this: I am proud to have served. Proud to have been a Gurkha. Proud to have upheld our traditions. But most proud that my comrades lived because I refused to quit. That's what matters. Not medals or recognition, but knowing you did your duty and your brothers went home to their families. Those were the last public words Lachhiman Gurung spoke. 15 months later, he was gone. But his story remains. It's told in barracks and training camps. It's studied in military academies. It's repeated in the villages of Nepal, where young boys still dream of becoming Gurkhas. And on quiet nights, when soldiers stand watch in dangerous places around the world, some remember the small man with one hand who held off an army. They remember his example. They remember his courage. They remember that one person in the right place with the right spirit can change the course of history. That's the legacy of Havildar Lachhiman Gurung, VC. Not just what he did on one extraordinary night, but what his example continues to inspire in others. The Victoria Cross citation ends with these words: Rifleman Gurung's outstanding gallantry, cool courage, and grim determination in the face of almost overwhelming odds were an inspiration to all ranks. Almost overwhelming odds, the British gift for understatement at its finest. The truth was simpler. One small man, one working hand, one Lee Enfield rifle, one unbreakable spirit. Against those elements, 200 Japanese soldiers weren't nearly enough. Ayo Gorkhali, the Gurkhas are upon you. There's a Nepali proverb, Lahure ko janma chinchor parcha. Even in a soldier's dead body, life struggles to leave. Lachhiman Gurung embodied this saying literally. He should have died that night in Tangdao. The grenade explosion should have killed him instantly. The blood loss should have incapacitated him within minutes. The Japanese assault should have overrun his position within the first hour. Yet he survived. Not just survived, he prevailed. He turned certain death into improbable victory through sheer refusal to accept defeat.